Time has expired. Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your very powerful testimony, and I echo my colleagues that I admire very much your courage in being here. I appreciate, Dr. Zenz, your work, early work in describing this as a genocide, which now the State Department, our State Department, has recognized. I understand that your early work estimated that there were about 1 million people who have been detained. I wonder, what is the number today?
The latest evidence from the Xinjiang police files, both from the speech of China's National Minister of Public Security, Zhao Keji, who estimates that over 2 million people in southern Xinjiang are infected by religious extremism requiring treatment, and spreadsheets, extensive spreadsheets based on nearly 300,000 individuals in one county, indicating an internment of between 12 and 12.5% of the entire county's ethnic adult population. Based on these data points, my current estimate of mass internment in the region is broadly between 1 and 2 million, and it's on purpose a range because we don't have anything precise. But we can now, with greater, I think, accuracy and authority, say that very likely between 1 and 2 million were detained at some point. We just don't know who's been released, who's been shifted, where. We've seen this huge prison complex. And unfortunately, actually, just in January this year, after the protests in Urumqi, after the fire, I've been hearing reports of a new wave of detention, at least in Urumqi and possibly in other cities. There's nothing more detailed.
So currently about 1 to 2 million are detained?
I would say 1 to 2 million in total have been detained. The current detention numbers are very difficult to ascertain.
Mr. Turkle, would you know what the current detention is?
You know, I rely on what the Chinese government says in its white paper, stating that since 2015, 1.3 million Uyghurs went through a re-education program. If you add them up, you come up with a staggering number. They said this in a white paper. It has been widely cited.
I guess when I'm trying to drive it, I agree. I admire your work on genocide, and I'm trying to understand what is going to be effective U.S. policy to try to get those numbers down and to try to help in human rights. And so, is the situation improving? Is it getting worse? Do we have any sense?
I think there's a lot of indication that the mass internments peaked sometime in 2018, probably the second half of 2018. People were beginning to be released from the camps into forced labor in late 2018, 2019. More people were being released by the end of 2019, but also quite a few were shifted to high security internment facilities, such as prisons, high security prisons, an unknown percentage. My estimate is several 100,000 at least were shifted into forced labor, probably several 100,000 at least shifted to prisons.
Let me ask the question this way, maybe. What would either of you say has been the most effective U.S. policy that has had an impact in helping Uyghurs in China?
The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
And to you, Mr. Turkle, and also in your testimony, I was very surprised. I'm sure you're right that all these things are still coming from the Uyghur region, because I would have assumed that the Forced Labor Act would have prevented that. Is that just not being enforced, or how are all these products
Here's the
coming
good
in?
news. You know, this is not a lost cause. We are, even though this genocide is still underway, we don't know how many people being detained and died. We're seeing some progress. Just today in the news that more than 50% of 900 American companies being surveyed in Beijing, in China, said they're not in favor of investing in China. So that's a good news. And also, a couple of years ago, Washington Post reported that one major yarn supplier were kind of complaining in their stock exchange report that they lost significant amount of money. On the economic side, yes. But on the political side, in a bilateral, multilateral aspect, no. So if you can, there's a back and forth. Some days we hear strong positions, strong statements. Some days we hear lukewarm responses and statements. And if we have been doing this alone, this has to be a global endeavor. That way, we might be able to be able to help in a certain way.
Representative Khanna, may I answer as well?
I think my time's
Briefly, if you would.
I just wanted to make note that perpetrators shift their tactics in response to evolving conditions. And I think we need to be very careful when asking and trying to ascertaining that question of where have we seen behavioral change. We need to actually task the intel community to look specifically for that type of information to help guide the efforts that are being undertaken. There has to be greater enforcement. There are serious concerns that forced labor is increasingly being an area that is now being pushed underground, whereby, yes, we might see a movement away from the types of products that could be coming to the United States, but could be going to other countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we need to be monitoring how the Belt and Road Initiative and those outputs are potentially being impacted by forced labor coming from Xinjiang and other ways in which that is having an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too would like to thank the first two witnesses, the two ladies, for sharing your testimony and your experience at the hands of the CCP. I want to thank you for bringing to the top of our conscience and our awareness here in the United States the plight of the Uyghur people and the genocide they're experiencing in China. I have a question either for Mr. Turkle or Dr. Zentz, I believe. Xinjiang, I'm sorry I pronounced the location, Xinjiang, has polysilicon production for solar panels, which, let me tell you, has truly wreaked havoc in our domestic manufacturing, in my district particularly, all while using forced labor and selling panels around the world. We also believe that there are, in this area of China, there are non-ferrous minerals, cobalt, gold, silver, platinum, palladium. Do we know if there are other critical minerals? And on both of these issues, how can we further address sanctions on these minerals and the products that are coming from Xinjiang, from China?
So with polysilicon, it's a bit like cotton. Xinjiang produces 90% of the cotton
90%.
in China, and so with polysilicon, it's a very high percentage. So it's a very high risk that anything polysilicon solar-related from China is implicated in Xinjiang. And so one strategy, or the strategy to go for, is to divest from China in that respect, to build Western capacity, both for the procurement of the raw materials and the construction of the solar panels. So basically, this is a matter of shifting supply chains. In terms of the general risk, a lot of people are not aware. So this is not just a matter of cotton, polysilicon, tomatoes, and other products. These supply chains have been very specifically implicated, but Xinjiang has two complementary systems of forced labor, one directly out of the camps, the other one out of highly coercive poverty elevation, scooping up villages and rounding them up, basically. And as a result, we have a forced labor problem that extends into a very wide range of industries. Xinjiang is being used because of cheap energy to produce products that are very high energy intensive, such as the production of polysilicon. So that constitutes a particular risk.
Thank you, Dr. Shins. Chair Turkle, your testimony highlights the danger posed by university research collaboration with Chinese entities that may facilitate advances in surveillance technology. Yeah. What obligations would you say do foreign universities owe the Uyghur people to ensure that joint research does not contribute to the ongoing genocide? At the very least, should the U.S. government ensure that federal research dollars do not go to entities in China that may contribute to the genocide, the PLA advances, or other human rights in China?
Certainly. There are a number of issues involving our universities. One is research, as you alluded. The other one is self-centering. We're not hearing the vocal China scholars today publicly condemning, for the most part, except for several Xinjiang scholars or Uyghur scholars, still self-centering. They're sometimes just disturbingly echo CCP propaganda. And also, One other point to your research-related questions. A few years ago, there was a professor at Yale Medical School, Kenneth Kidd, was implicated, being widely reported for him bringing in a lab assistant from China's Ministry of Public Security to conduct research on Uyghur DNA. So that gives you an idea what kind of problems that we have. We're talking about university endowments, but we have research projects that have been aiding and abetting some of the stated goals of the CCP government. That includes scientific research, that includes technological engineering field, that also includes biomedical research. That needs to stop.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks to all of you for your testimony this evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this very powerful testimony. And we would be doing a great disservice to your courage and bravery if we don't come out of this with some concrete steps and actions that we can take to move forward. Mr. Turkle, I wanted to start with you. You laid out some very specific proposals in your testimony, laying out some steps that the Secretary of State and other senior officials can do more going forward, or increasing diplomatic efforts to nations hosting Uyghurs or other Muslim-majority nations. You even mentioned this idea of a State Department China regional office program expansion. Can you talk a little bit more about the important role that State Department and diplomacy can make here?
Yes. First of all, Congressman Kim, thank you for asking that question. First of all, we have to elevate human rights in our dialogue with Beijing. They elevated human rights, religious freedom issues as part of their pushback against Western influence starting 2014. That have been integrated into Chinese national security strategy. Where are we? We're still making human rights, religious freedom, individual freedom, press freedom a kind of a secondary issue. That needs to change. Two, we need to revisit our strategies, specifically communication strategies. We have to continue to call it genocide. It's a U.S. policy. Two successive administrations and this Congress recognizes a genocide along with our partners and allies in Western democracy, including Taiwan. So we have to call it genocide, crimes against humanity. That message needs to be repeated every day. And then three, we have to engage like-minded governments, even the governments that are lukewarm. I do a fair amount of international travel. As part of the China regional China officers program. We have only 19 around the world. Each officer has about $50,000 budget that need to be increased.
Yeah, and that's something that I thought, Ms. Kikuler, you mentioned something earlier in this hearing where you talked about, for instance, maybe taking further steps to engage with the UN General Assembly and other nations in that kind of capacity. What I'm taking away from this, would you agree with the idea that it's vital for the United States to engage with the UN and other international organizations in the same way that Mr. Turkle was talking about with other nations as well?
It is absolutely essential for the U.S. to be engaging in constant dialogue with those organizations, but also in those international fora. Under the Trump administration, one of the really important things that they did was they actually convened a high-level meeting at the United Nations, including senior UN officials, to raise the profile of the plight of the Uyghurs, of which many of the people in this room participated. It was one of the first instances in which the discussion of the Uyghurs and the commission of the crimes against them was actually brought to the international fora. It's really important that we continue to see that ongoing level of putting a face to the crimes, and that we do that before the UN bodies. Thank you.
And I really think that this hearing is so important. It first of all highlights the atrocities that are happening, but it also is showing us why we need to have a comprehensive approach, why we need to use all the tools at our disposal here. This is something that where we recognize that this crisis demands more diplomatic action, more coalition building with nations and institutions around the world, and more efforts in that capacity here. We have offices and people at the State Department and elsewhere charged with this, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, others working with refugees and humanitarian assistance, but I believe they can do more. Ms. Kikuler, would you agree that it would be productive if we can take what we heard today and work in a bipartisan way to increase our support for these diplomatic efforts at State Department and USAID?
Yes, without a doubt. I mean, I think we're in a situation where, as we've all stated before, There can be no single country that is going to solve the problem right now that is facing the Uyghur community. We have to have a multilateral and an international response to the crimes that are occurring. The role of Congress is absolutely critical. In 2018, there was the passage of the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act, of which many of you co-sponsored and signed on to it. It explicitly said that the prevention of these types of crimes is a core national security interest of the U.S. government. Yeah. You have the ability to ask the current administration what they are doing to integrate the protection of the Uyghur people in broader China policy, and what that means both in terms of domestic but also international engagement. Thank you.
What I hope we think through here is, because I'm a little worried here, because I was just in a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing earlier today with Secretary Blinken, and there were serious concerns raised there that the Republican majority is considering steps like returning to FY22 budget spending levels or other spending proposals that could levy billions of dollars of budget cuts on the State Department and USAID. Now, in our last hearing, we heard a lot about the need to be able to surge resources when it comes to our military might and deterrence. And today, I hope we take these unbelievably powerful testimonies and heed the call to invest in our diplomacy, our global coalition building, and to encourage and surge our work with international institutions. And I hope all of us on both sides of the aisle commit to increasing, not decreasing, our investment in diplomacy with the same urgency as we talk about for our military. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here this evening and your valuable testimony, and especially the powerful and sobering testimony from the brave women who spoke on our first panel. Much of what has been shared this evening is a powerful reminder of how fortunate we are to be living in the United States, to have the freedoms guaranteed to us. The treatment of the Uyghur people by the Communist Chinese Party resembles that of a dark dystopian novel. And hearings like this are essential in alerting Congress and the American people that these acts are not some far-fetched fictional event. They are real, and they are happening as we speak. The United States must continue to play an active role in condemning this egregious treatment through a combination of directed humanitarian, economic, and diplomatic efforts. As we look at the global economy and international trade, we need to be vigilant in all levels of our supply chains. Turning a blind eye to forced labor practices cannot be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. Mr. Turkle, as we previously mentioned, passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by the Congress was a great step expressly combating against these forced labor practices, particularly in the Xinjiang region. But our work is obviously far from finished. In your view, what should some of the immediate next steps be for the Congress to take? Is it looking at the sectors currently labeled as high priority by the Department of Homeland Security and considering new sectors that should be added? Or are there other steps that should be taken first?
Three things. One, thank you for the question. First, we need to have a full briefing. This committee could organize a full briefing on the obstacles to fully implement this significant law. And then two, we need to close the black hole as part of the USMCA agreement that bans forced labor-produced products. But the Xinjiang exports are still making it to the United States, reportedly through Mexico and Canada. So that needs to be addressed. And then also Europe has been a dumping ground. There's no national or European Parliament, European Union level of engagement or policy responses have been announced. A couple of years ago, there was a report published by USCIS. It reported Italy in the year 2019-2020, the export volume to Italy from Xinjiang doubled. So we have Europe being still one of the continued destination for so we have to get into get Europeans and other allies, even including Japan, including Australia, to essentially do something that this Congress did.
Thank you for that. I think we can all agree that in order for there to be some sort of meaningful change, we're going to need more commitments from our allies around the globe, and also be taking constructive steps to combat these atrocities. I think the hypocrisy is, and the irony is, when you look at the Arab world, who obviously many of the Sunni countries share a religious heritage with the Uyghurs. And I want to, it was mentioned earlier about the Belt and Road Initiative by Ms. Ki Kalor. I want to read a statement here that's in an article from June 2nd, 2022, titled, "Why Muslim Countries in the Middle East Support Chinese Atrocities in Xinjiang." Here's what it says. Chinese Belt and Road initiatives projected to grow to over $1 trillion by 2027 are especially important for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, all of which have signed comprehensive strategic partnerships, one of the highest levels of Belt and Road partnership with China. Consequently, each of these states has firmly defended China's oppressive actions in Xinjiang. In addition to publicly endorsing China's Xinjiang policies, all of these countries have deported Uyghurs back to China at Beijing's request. The defensive motivations and behavior are clear. Egypt and Saudi Arabia want to continue the Belt and Road initiatives with China. I'm going to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, 3 articles. One from Time Magazine from March 24th, 2022, titled, "The Arab World Isn't Just Silent on China's Crackdown on Uyghurs, It's Complicit." Number 2, from The Hill, December 9th, 2022, "Arab Nations Should Press China on Uyghur Muslim Abuses." And thirdly, the article I just talked about from the Institute for the Study of Democracy, June 2nd, 2022, "Why Muslim Countries in the Middle East Support Chinese Atrocities."
Without objection, it'll be added to the record.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sherrill.